once in 100 lifetimes, a figure sets foot on the earth and changes the course of human history. They influence how humans interact with their neighbors, their community, their country, and how they conduct themselves as global citizens. Yet rarely does the world recognize their contribution during their lifetime. The seeds they plant lie dormant. But as time passes, the impact of their thoughts and deeds crystallizes into a fresh pathway for humankind. One such figure was William Penn, Quaker statesman and man of vision, founder of Pennsylvania and planner of Philadelphia, friend of the Indians, crusader for civil and religious liberty, and designer of European peace. The seeds he planted centuries ago are breaking through crusty soil.
Penn recounted to his friend John Aubrey, who was writing an account of his life, a really important episode that happened at Chigwell. Here's what he said. The first sense Penn had of God...
I'm a native Pennsylvanian, born and raised in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Went through 12 years of Pennsylvania public school system and always learned a little bit about Penn during that week of state history time.
Introduction to Penn's collected works. It's about a couple...
I really got interested in Penn when I was working on my doctoral dissertation in political theory, studying the history of religious freedom. There's something about the fact that he's up there on City Hall in Philadelphia, and yet he's a figure that everyone knows a little, but no one knows well.
A couple of these I hope to kind of demystify for you, and a couple of them
Penn was someone I figured, well, he must be one of the big names, and what I discovered was that actually he had not received, to my mind, the kind of academic attention that I would have expected. And so that became a sort of part of my own career as it went along, was to sort of look at him not simply as a historical figure, but also as a figure who was part of an ongoing story of the development of religious liberty, both in England and America.
That is where we get the name of this colony that becomes a state, Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods. So actually Pennsylvania has the name of not William Penn, but his father, because remember, Quakers were
living in Pennsylvania. We may be actually immune to the importance of a man named William Penn. His name is just our state, but it actually is a family name that's filled with history, a story that goes back into the early 1600s.
But William Penn said, I want this to be a place where people will be able to live together side by side as brothers. And when the Constitution...
And it actually is a story of a man who is a persecuted minority.
So to me, the time is right for a new look at this familiar and yet mysterious figure.
I'm Michael Phipps. I'm an elder of this Quaker meeting at Jordan's in Buckinghamshire in England. This Quaker meeting house was built in 1688 with funds donated by William Penn, who also worshipped here during his lifetime.
William Penn was born in 1644 in the Tower district of London, 2 years into the bloody conflict of the English Civil War. Penn's family resided on Seething Lane, which was just a few blocks from All Hallows Church, where Penn was baptized as an infant.
He was the son of a distinguished member of the community in Britain in the mid-17th century. His father, Admiral Sir William Penn, was an admiral, a close confidant of the king. So he was born into privilege and wealth.
When he grew up surrounded by the kind of trappings of influence and prestige, and his father had high hopes for young William, his son. Penn lived in a society in England where many of the most influential positions in the government, in the economy, in the universities, and in a variety of sort of elite institutions, all were reserved for Anglicans, or at least for people who would pretend to be Anglicans.
And all others, whether they were Roman Catholics or Protestant sects, were regarded as subversive and dangerous, both in religious and spiritual terms, but also as being potentially against the monarchy and Parliament. And so they were persecuted and hounded. They were prevented from meeting. Their property was taken from them. They were imprisoned, and some even died for their faith. Penn saw the discrimination, the violence, the oppression, the quarrels that tore apart families and that tore apart communities.
As an admiral in the Royal Navy, his father recognized the value of education. He puts his son into Chigwell, which is an elite school. We Americans would think of it as an elementary school.
It's been a continuously functioning school since 1629. It's the place where he had his first recorded religious experience, a mystical, spiritual experience, and he remembered it for the rest of his life.
The Lord visited me and gave me divine impressions of himself.
And it's while at Chigwell that young William Penn develops smallpox and is treated for this with the miracle cure of mercury, which causes early pattern baldness in this 11-year-old boy.
A failed naval exploit of Admiral Penn's landed him in prison in the dreaded Tower of London.
When he was released, he decided that it would be a good idea if the family and he made themselves scarce, and so they went to Ireland, where they spent about 4 or 5 years, while young William was in his early teens.
The family made their home at Macroom Castle outside of Cork. It was here where young William first encountered a Quaker preacher.
So a traveling Quaker preacher named Thomas Lowe came through County Cork and preached to the family, and they had a Quaker meeting in the castle where the Penn family was living.
And Thomas Lowe said, the scriptures say faith overcomes the world. What kind of faith do you have? Do you have a faith that's overcome by the world, or do you have a faith that overcomes the world? And Penn said that pricked him to his very soul. And he said, I want the kind of faith that changes the world.
Penn is a very spiritual young man, and he's a very inquisitive young man. His father will support his education. He will move on to go to Oxford.
Christ Church is one of the oldest colleges in the University of Oxford, and as were all universities in those early days of their foundation, they were established as educational institutions, but also as religious institutions. And church was really at the heart of all the formation of a young person's life. So William Penn trained here, and of course his father had a dream that he would be the very best lawyer, but actually God got a hold of him.
When he was at Oxford University studying at his desk, he had an experience that a light came into the room and he heard a voice that he believed was God speaking to him. And the voice said, "He shall build my city and he shall set my captives free." And Penn felt that that was such a dramatic spiritual experience that he felt that God at that moment put a divine seal upon his heart and upon his life.
However, much to Admiral Penn's dismay, within 6 months of arriving in Oxford, the faculty write a letter to Admiral Penn asking them to take his son home. William is somewhat rebellious. He is perpetually questioning, even challenging what he's told by the authorities at Oxford.
When his son pulled out of Oxford, it was such a disappointment to Father William Penn. His father whipped him.
The bitter usage I underwent when I returned to my father, whipping, beating, and turning out of doors.
Admiral Penn is sort of scratching his head, what do I do with this boy? He sends him to Europe to study, and young William lands in Semur, France, and studies at a Huguenot academy. Many historians feel that this is the point where the seed of religious freedom is planted with Penn, because Huguenots are advocates of religious diversity. They are being persecuted in France at this time, and Penn is bearing witness to this as a student there. He will tour Europe, but his father will call him back at a point when the war clouds are gathering, and young William is being groomed to go into the family business, which is the military.
Penn's father rallied the Royal Navy for war against the Dutch. Though William had begun to pursue a career in law, he ended up returning to England and sailing with his father to war. Once William returned, he completed his study of law and began his practice in Ireland in 1666.
He was back in Ireland and discovered that Thomas Lowe was himself back in Ireland preaching, so went to hear Lowe preach, and that was the point at which he became a convinced Quaker in 1667 when he was in his early 20s.
His father said, if you go that way of that simple faith and the Quakers, you will be cut off from the royal funds, you will be cut off from that call. And Penn said, I have to go by what's in my heart and my conscience. And so he made that decision no matter what the cost.
I'll let you know that the architect wanted this to be the finest capital, a palace of art, but he also knew what Penn's vision was, and he wanted that vision literally on the walls of the Capitol.
Well, it started actually with an artist who said to me, do you realize what's on the walls of the Capitol?
Look how art is influencing you, just seeing the art and what it's represented.
So she took me to look at the different paintings from Violet Oakley on the Capitol, and as I was watching that, I realized there's a message here that's right on the walls. It's like hidden in plain sight.
And in this room, you are going to see the history of religious liberty, because William
And so I started studying about that, and the more that I found out, the more I thought this story needs to be told.
And the story starts with him as a 16-year-old.
I never advertised tours. It just turned out that people started wanting to hear this. So I started just taking a few friends.
War would end. The disarmament would happen.
And I'll never forget the day that the legislators took the tour. Some of them had been there 30 years and didn't know what was on the walls.
So the divine law is the foundation, then the law of nature, then the revealed
When Violet Oakley did her paintings, she tried to get the heart and the spirit of the Quakers and of Penn's viewpoints and his writings.
Okay, the law that God revealed through Jesus is the Beatitudes. He gives his Sermon on the Mount, and the Beatitudes tell you how you should live.
The Quakers believe that everyone has access to the inner light, they call it. Everyone of every religion has access to the Spirit of God impacting their hearts, giving them light, giving them truth, giving them a conscience.
All Christians would accept the notion that we're made in the image of God. Now, does that image of God mean that God is already living within us? A Quaker would say yes.
This is Warminghurst Chapel. This is the church in the parish of Warminghurst where William Penn lived. But this church is not Penn's church. This building was not a place that he was welcome in, and he himself would not have come into this building, because this is a Church of England establishment. And the Quakers, in some ways, set themselves against the national church. And in fact, this church would have preached against William Penn. This was Penn's field. He would have walked down some of these tracks. Off down there, across those fields, is the Quaker meeting house. He would have ridden his horse and his cart to the Quaker meeting house. This was in fact the land that he owned when he was writing the Constitution and the documents for Pennsylvania. After Penn died and his land was sold, the next landowner deliberately burnt down Penn's barns and buildings in order to erase all memory of William Penn, because he was seen as a traitor.
Quakers were part of a broad coalition of religious groups seeking to end persecution, to end the variety of ways in which religious dissenters were marginalized in English society.
They would not do hat honor because you don't defer to human beings, you do to God. It wasn't that they were antisocial. In fact, they were more friendly to the poor and the weak, and that ran to the core of who they were. Thus, they became unpopular with the ruling class.
One of the main things the Church of England did was create citizens of Englishness, little babies being born into the English state and being authenticated through their baptism. So William Penn and the Quakers were Anabaptists.
Anabaptists believed that only adults should be baptized, not children.
So when Quakers got baptized as adults, they were doing more than just making a spiritual declaration of being born again. They were making also a political statement of where their allegiance and their true citizenship lay. Now, at the same time, the Quakers were not violently opposed to England. They weren't raising weapons against the king. They weren't trying to burn down the Church of England. They were just opting out. They were just symbolizing our claims of allegiance are in a different place.
Quakers from the 1650s onwards were subject to persecution, as indeed were other dissenting religious groups. They were not permitted by law to worship together as a religious community. They were required to attend church, the established church, every Sunday. They didn't do that. They met together privately as worshipping Quaker communities. And those worshipping groups were often broken up in the middle of a period of worship. People were arrested and taken to prison. Many of them also had their goods taken from them, their houses seized, and they were cast out homeless. Those who went to prison suffered dreadful conditions: disease, lack of food, lack of light, lack of exercise.
When someone would launch a critique of Quakers, Penn was one of the ones who would rush something into print, and so he was one of the best-known dissenters in England, prolific writer and a gifted orator. So in all these ways, he really became a kind of national celebrity.
He was accused of breaking the law that said you can only preach in a church building, and you have to have a license to preach from the king. He didn't have a license, and he was preaching on the street. By definition, Quakers were street preachers. That's where they did their sermons, and it was against the law.
Penn sought to challenge this law by deliberately preaching in the streets to provoke an arrest. Once arrested, he challenged the validity of this conventicle act in open court.
A fellow Quaker named Meade and he are arrested and they are jailed. The initial idea of Penn was to challenge this law. However, the charges that come at him are not about that law, but are of sedition and inciting a riot, which are more serious charges. Penn argues the case because he has studied law at Lincoln's. The judge is very dismissive of Penn and of the Quaker faith. However, this sets a tone that does not sit well with many of the jurors. And ultimately, the jurors do find Penn guilty of speaking in public, but not inciting a riot.
The court was furious and ordered all the jurors to be imprisoned, at which point Penn called out,
"Remember the Magna Carta. Remember you are Englishmen. Don't give away your rights."
And the court ordered them to be imprisoned until they paid a fine.
The public outcry is such that the judge has to reverse himself, and Penn and Meade and the jury are set free.
The case stands for the principle that the court cannot tell the jury what verdict to find, and an acquittal is not appealable.
If we get to serve on a jury to determine the fate of one of our fellow citizens, or if our fate is in the hands of fellow jury members, we owe that to Penn.
During the first few years that he was a Quaker, Penn was imprisoned on several occasions. The lengthiest imprisonment was in the Tower of London. He was thrown in the Tower of London on a blasphemy charge. He had written a pamphlet which appeared to deny the doctrine of the Trinity.
And yet, when he was imprisoned in the Tower of London, he took pen to parchment and wrote, "No cross, no crown."
The early Christians had integrity. Their presence was powerful. It turned the edge of the sword away. It dulled the instruments of cruelty. It convicted judges and converted executioners.
No Cross, No Crown is one of a number of books that Penn wrote, but it's probably his best known, and in it he sets out very eloquently the basis of his religious beliefs, but also how those inspired the living of a good and godly life in the community.
Each person should be an example of good, and thereby justly entitled to happiness, in the present as well as to a seat at God's right hand, where there are joys and pleasures forevermore.
After 9 months in prison, Penn was released, and he returned to Ireland until he heard news of his father's imminent death.
Only on his father's deathbed did he reconcile with William, who had become what we would call a pacifist. They made their peace and he could go on from there.
In Buckinghamshire, where we are now, he met and subsequently married his first wife, Julie Elmer. They were married at a place where Quakers met for worship, not very far from this meeting house.
After their marriage, they moved into a home in nearby Chorleywood, where they lived for 5 years.
They came regularly to Old Jordan's farm, which is just up the hill from this meeting house, and which is where Quakers met at risk of persecution until the Declaration of Indulgence allowed them to build this meeting house in 1688. Like many in that time of the 17th century, they had a number of children. 8 to 10 children was by no means unusual for a family in their position. And like many families, several of their children, 5 in fact, died in infancy.
He lived a really dashing life, had a young family, and it was really only after about a decade or so of frustration at not being able to achieve religious freedom in England, not just for Quakers, but for dissenters more generally.
Penn's experience in prison led him to see that what was really needed was a safe haven for people, and so that's what prompted him to find an opportunity to build a new community entirely afresh.
In 1680, Penn petitioned Charles II for a land grant in the New World, a place he believed could be a safe haven for Quakers and other persecuted religious minorities. He faced what he called great opposition of envious great men in his pursuit of this grant.
William Penn inherits a substantial war chest from his father. He also inherited the credit of a debt that was owed to his father based upon services during the English Civil War, but on foreign shores. The Crown had borrowed money from Admiral Penn. Admiral Penn sadly had passed away. Charles I, who incurred the debt, was killed in the Civil War. So the debt goes to the 2 sons. Charles II recognizes the debt. Negotiations happen, and Charles II, with a nod from his younger brother James, grant land to William Penn in the New World west of the Delaware.
This day, my country confirmed to me under the Great Seal of England, Pennsylvania. It is a clear and just thing, and my God, who has given it me through many difficulties, will, I believe, make it a seed of a nation.
And so the king bestowed upon him this land, which he called Pennsylvania. Penn insisted it was not named after him because that would have been vanity, but it is named after his father.
With his land grant secured, Penn immediately began work on the political foundations for the colony.
He came up with the draft of the frame of government. It went through multiple revisions. He would give it to his friends for feedback. And it looked actually quite different when he finished than where he started. But the one thing that never varied through all of the different drafts was at its fundamental core, Pennsylvania would be characterized by religious liberty.
Penn finished his initial frame of government in 1682, shortly before his first voyage to America. He set sail for the colony aboard the ship Welcome in August of 1682. His beloved wife Julielma stayed behind with the children due to her health.
Remember, thou wast the love of my youth, and much the joy of my life, the most beloved as well as most worthy of all of my earthly comforts.
The arduous 8-week journey took its toll on the passengers. 31 out of the 100 on board died. Penn stepped ashore for the first time in his new territory in what is now Chester, Pennsylvania, on October 29, 1682. People gathered to hear Penn's assurance of religious freedom and protection of their human rights. Within a few days, he headed upriver to the future location of his capital city, Philadelphia.
He was an astute student of urban planning. In his life, he had lived through the plague in London and then the Great Fire. He recognized that the way London was laid out did not work well for either of those. And if we go to visit Philadelphia today, that same grid section of the core of the historic area of town is there, and it's very easy to understand. His desire was that people would have green space around their homes, have their own areas that they could cultivate. Of course, river frontage was at a higher premium than further inland, but he had a great vision for building this green country town.
It seems like he's everywhere all at once because everyone wants his attention, everyone wants his time. He discovers that he's sold more land than he actually has, so he spends lots of time trying to appease disgruntled settlers and really trying to sort of put the institutions in place.
I like the land and the food very well. The air proveth sweet and good, the land fertile. The weather often changeth without notice, and is constant almost in its inconstancy.
Well, I grew up here along the Branch Creek, the east branch of the Perkiomen. I was formed out of it. My mom ate the eggs and the milk, and those molecules were what became me. And then I started asking myself, what about this land? And as I got older, I more and more reflected on the fact that I'm here because of other people coming here. And I got to reading in William Penn's letters. And I found a letter from June 23, 1709, from William Penn to his secretary in Philadelphia. And it said, "Herewith comes the Palatines, a sober people who will neither fight nor swear, divers Menonists." He knew there were different kinds. And then he goes on to say, treat them with tenderness and love. On this first boat of the people that bought this land were Culps and Clemenses, two Mennonite families. And the Clemenses built a house right here on this property. This is part of John Clemens's mill property. Now my grandchildren brought up from the branch this weight for a net that the Indians had to catch fish. And on the next farm here, dozens and dozens of these were found. And a friend of mine found hundreds of pieces on one field just on the next farm. So it all stirs my curiosity. The Indians that were here, they were called Lenapes, which means the original people, the old people. They lived along the creeks. And I got curious. Why don't I know anything about them? It's all my story. That got on my conscience. Then I started asking about the Lenapes.
Penn says he's going to come and he's going to establish his governance in this new land, but he's going to buy it again from the Indians because they were already living there.
They didn't understand at the very beginning what selling their land was. When William Penn sat down and talked with them, they said, "You're different from other governors. You come and you're living with us. And yeah, you want to buy land? Okay, we'll give you some." They were willing to give. And a Lenape feel the happiest when they have given you something. It's their pleasure. William Penn said, you give them a fine gun or something, it may pass 20 hands before it sticks. They just pass it around. But he brought twice piles of gifts. Gunpowder, lead, they needed it by now. The Dutch and the Swedes had taught them to shoot and trap. And they wanted mirrors, and they wanted awls, and they wanted buttons, and they wanted things like that. So Penn gave them 2 big piles. And they said, we can get along with you.
I truly believe that William Penn knew that we were indigenous to this land, that we were here first, and that we understood the land. We understood the waters, the rivers, the hills, the mountains, the hunting. We were able to show him how to hunt, how to gather, how to farm. And he respected our people for our knowledge of how we live.
So there was a high honor, a high respect, and there was actually a love between Penn and the native chiefs.
William Penn and the Lenni Lenape, they walked together as one. There was not one lording over another. They walked in harmony as brothers.
There had been horrendous wars between colonists and native peoples in the 10 to 20 years prior to Penn arriving here. To the north was King Philip's War. And a decade before Penn gets here, that war will depopulate New England by 1/3, both colonial and native, and take on a life of its own. Wars are expensive. It's a drain to the crown.
The king said, you better have a big army because those Indians are savages. And Penn very wisely responded, they're not savages. The only reason that they're coming to massacre the British is because the British came to kill them and take their land.
The things that were done against this land and the people, it really marred the plan and even the destiny that had been given to our people to be the proper host.
The Lenape people, we're called the grandfather tribe. We were the first ones to sign a treaty with the United States government. We were peaceful people. We weren't people that were looking to start wars. We were looking to fight. You know, we coexisted when William Penn was here. We were able to forage and we were able to hunt and to gather.
He bumped into the right group at the right time. The Lenape, or as we would call them today, Delaware, they were adept warriors, but they were not in a warfaring mode at that time. And for a brief instance in American history, there was mutual coexistence.
We were able to continue our hunting, our cultural, our religious practices. We didn't have a problem. We had no issues with William Penn.
The Lenape were people of the land, just as you will find many native people to be. They understood that we are stewards of the land, and so they lived as such.
And when we look up the Branch Creek, we know that 9 miles upstream is Percy, where William Penn in 1683 sat down with an Indian chief called Tammany, and they had a good time. They exchanged promises, great promises, Penn said. And the Lenape said, you're not like the other people that have come to New York and Virginia.
The legend of Penn and the Great Treaty lives on today. The truth is, historians have never found the Great Treaty. Many Quaker biographers call it the treaty that was never written and never broken. However, there's a lot of legend around this. Because historians can't find the treaty, what most historians believe is it is not a single treaty, but it's a series of land agreements. The legendary one occurs in Shakamakson, which we would know currently as Penn Treaty Park in Philadelphia, between William Penn and King Tenement. And it is an agreement of mutual life and coexistence. Built into those early deeds, you see Penn saying, when you buy this land, you need to give the Lenape access to their fishing lands and to their hunting lands. And that becomes part of the narrative.
So Pennsylvania was special. It was not just another colony that way.
We meet on the broad pathway of good faith and goodwill. No advantage shall be taken by either side, but all shall be openness and love. We are the same, as if one man's body was divided into two parts. We are one flesh and blood.
Aholta wakaning hu nawitausuma wananak nakima tisana onas okwanichana nesheki game pemahenetit nel sipua ok nesheki game aputit na kishuch ok na piskeweni kishuch ok ne kalangok.
Within a year of Penn's arrival, nearly 3,000 people had settled in the rapidly growing territory, and over 600 new residents had built homes in Philadelphia. Penn had revised his frame of government to simplify it and address grievances settlers had against it. A bitter border dispute between Penn and Lord Baltimore, founder of Maryland, left them no option but to sail back to London to argue their case in person. To his dismay, upon arrival, he found Bridewell and Newgate prisons filled with Quakers. Internal political conflicts even threatened to undo the Pennsylvania Charter. His Quaker brothers criticized him deeply for his political views. News of the turmoil in his colony wore heavily on him.
Your division has torn me to pieces. You are of one family and should aim at the public good.
Penn was accused of conspiracy against the crown and subsequently was charged with treason. His trusted steward, Philip Ford, embezzled funds and betrayed him. Then, in 1694, Julie Elma finally succumbed to her lifelong illnesses. Penn gathered his family and said goodbye to his beloved wife.
She was an excelling person, one of the most excellent women that I believe the world has had.
Penn's fortunes began to turn. He found a position of honor once again with both the Quakers and English Parliament. He married his second wife, Hannah Callowhill. In 1699, with fresh investment capital, he would return to Pennsylvania.
But the founding magic was gone. He was 15 years older. The Pennsylvanians had been governing themselves, to their minds, perfectly well for the last 15 years.
Pennsylvania's population grew rapidly. In Philadelphia, Penn's tree plantings provided the green urban spaces he had envisioned. Residents could shop for imported merchandise along city streets. Upon Penn's insistence, all citizens could attend Quaker grammar schools, which resulted in an educated workforce. Philadelphia became a leader in science and medicine.
It would not displease me to lay my bones where I've laid my labor, money, and solicitation, in Pennsylvania.
In 1701, Penn signed the Charter of Privileges, his best solution to meet the demands of those left behind to lead the colony. This charter would remain as the Constitution for Pennsylvania until the American Revolution. The year 1701 and the charter have a little-known connection to one of America's most iconic emblems.
The story of the Liberty Bell in Pennsylvania is something that sadly too many Americans do not know. On the top of it is the verse from Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 10. It says, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." Now, why would they take a verse from Leviticus and put it on a State House bell? Because it was the 50th year of William Penn's charter privileges. Its final version, 1701, 1751. And they knew their Bible well enough to know that the 50th year is called the Jubilee. The charter gave religious liberty to everybody, and it has 4 meanings of liberty. It has the biblical meaning of liberty, which is the Jubilee year. It has the William Penn implication of the 50th anniversary, religious liberty, and now it has political liberty. It now is celebrating the birth of a new nation. It will go on for quite some years. It was whisked out of town when Philadelphia fell to the British. It spent a year in the old Zion Reformed Church up in Allentown, so I like to say it went to church for a whole year. Then it cracked some years later. They mended it by drilling it out, and then they plugged it because it was no longer vibrating, so it would ring. Well, it rang a little bit longer and it cracked again, this time ringing out Washington's birthday. Now, what is fascinating, the bell almost got thrown into the junkyard, but a group came along and said, wait a second, doesn't it say proclaim liberty throughout the land to all the inhabitants thereof? And they said, this is our vision. They were called the abolitionists. They were committed to ending slavery. And the Liberty Bell was actually given its name and became the icon that it is in America because the abolitionists brought it around and spoke about how America needed to end slavery.
Even when Penn first formed what we know now as Pennsylvania, they actually had slaves. But it was because of their knowledge and understanding of the Bible that very quickly afterwards they changed their views and they fought to free slaves.
He established for us the equality of every human being. The organization of government itself he set up in his Charter of Privileges and frame of government. He established free elections, government by the people, justice that would not be sold, denied, or delayed, and defamation and malicious reporting. Most don't realize that those concepts came from Penn. Unfortunately, Penn had to leave the comfort of Pennsbury Manor to tend to his problems back in the royal courts. Penn didn't pay close enough attention to his financial affairs, resulting in significant indebtedness, which drove him to the brink of despair. He wrote to his secretary, James Logan,
I never was so low and so reduced. Oh, Pennsylvania, what hast thou not cost me? Above £30,000 more than I ever got by it. 2 hazardous and most fatiguing voyages, my straits and slavery here, and my son's soul almost.
He landed in debtor's prison, but soon after his release, he suffered a stroke and was paralyzed. The stroke unfortunately affected his mental acuity. He became like a child, but maintained a sweet disposition. William Penn died on July 30th, 1718, at the age of 74. His funeral took place at the burial ground of Jordan's Quaker Meeting House in Buckinghamshire, England, where Gulielma and several of his family were already interred. With his death, it seemed the seed of what drove his very existence while he lived would remain buried forever. But oh, the power of a seed.
When we look at legacy, there's good and bad in legacy, and for the Lenape, their trust in Penn and their belief in his vision was compromised by later generations, and in the infamous walking purchase, it will start them on a forced migration west.
The first of William Penn's sons from his second family, he had two families. The first family was really not inspiring in their behavior at all. And the second sons then were only interested in the money. They weren't Quakers anymore. They said, we just want to have freedom to sell all this land now.
The walking purchase actually occurs almost 20 years after Penn's death. Penn is debilitated by stroke 1711, and his wife actually takes over doing some of the governmental business. She's never given credit for it. She's never called governor, but in function, she's the governor in absentia of Pennsylvania. And she's holding together a household, and a household that is divided between the son from the first marriage, William Penn III, and her three sons. The debate is over what will happen to Pennsylvania. There continues to be immigration. There continues to be a need for land. They are facing crippling debt because Penn was not a good financial manager.
Thomas Penn and James Logan, Penn's secretary, made a deal with the northern Indians. The French called them the Iroquois, or the Six Nations. They said, we'll deal with you if you will help us to get rid of these, our Lenapes, they called them. And so they made a deal. And essentially, the Lenapes then had to agree that they would cede the land along the Delaware, but it had to be measured.
The agreement is as far as a man can walk in a day and a half. That agreement falls within a document that miraculously shows up after a year of negotiation that is not successful between that later generation of Penns and the Lenape. And it says that William Penn had already paid for this land and they just never measured it off. But the Penn's agent, James Logan, has arranged a path for this trajectory to go not due north as the Lenape were expecting, but to go northwest. And at the ending point, there's to be a 45-degree angle into the Delaware. If you move northwest, that angle becomes much more severe. And from Wrightstown, the walkers, who really are sprinters, cover basically from Wrightstown to Maw Chunk, which today we would know as Jim Thorpe.
His sons basically swindled 1 million acres out of the tribes with the walking purchase. I mean, the rebuke that the tribes would give to them is, if your father could see you now, if your father could see you now.
It wasn't until his sons, with a walking purchase, that actually forced us out of our homelands and forced us into 8 different removals from this area. We started out with about 30,000 people. On the first removal, we ended up in Kansas before we made it to Oklahoma with about 900. We lost a lot of Lenapes along the way.
And then, tragedy after tragedy, they had to move to what we would call Oklahoma, where there's about 10,000 Lenapes now.
I think we could learn from the early stories of how Penn and the Lenape people made agreement. If we were to look back just a little bit and see where we went wrong, I believe we could move forward together and learn from the early treaty and the early covenants and agreements that were made to live peaceably together.
I'm still here, and my people are still here. And I know my ancestors are looking down upon us, and I know they're proud.
Penn planted the seed of brotherly love for the native peoples, but that seed has lain dormant for over 2.5 centuries. The world is now beginning to witness that seed stirring to life.
this country, they fought the language. They fought our songs. They didn't want us to sing our song. They didn't want to beat the drum. They didn't want to dance. Well, that's all culture. Your language, the way you dance. I don't quite understand why culture was so bad to some people, other than the fact that it keeps people going, it keeps people alive. The churches said it was evil. The pastors said it was evil. Here I'm 71 years old, and still it lingers, and still it hurts.
We did the Indian Removal Act that moved the tribes from the east out west at great carnage and cost. We did the boarding schools where we were trying to kill the Indian culture. We should have dealt with natives as people, not as savages.
For years, Nigel and Sam sought an official apology from the U.S. government to the native peoples. Their efforts reached a milestone when President Barack Obama signed off on the Native American Apology Resolution Act in 2009.
To apologize for a person to do is hard, for a nation to do is really difficult. And the United States has apologized very few times. When this apology is done, when the president stands up in the Rose Garden and says those words of I apologize to Native Americans in front of the nation, in front of the world, in front of Native leaders, to me that'll be the closing of Book One. Now we can discover the new path. Love is the final fight.
It's that brotherly love that Penn was talking about, I believe. Here's our gift to you.
As the host people of Turtle Island, we forgive every atrocity and broken covenant ever designed to destroy us as a race of people. We forgive the government, the church, and the educational system for the use of residential schools that attempted to destroy our culture and silence our voice as people by stealing our language. We stand in the gap for those who are unable or unwilling to forgive, and call upon the Master of Life to forgive us for harboring unforgiveness, resentment, hatred, bitterness, and rage. And we release the power of forgiveness to bring healing and the peace of Creator God to this land. We declare and decree that our voice will no longer be silenced as we speak life and blessings over the Americas and the world. We declare our love as brothers, not returning evil for the evil perpetrated against us, but on the contrary, we choose to release a blessing, knowing that the Father of us all has called us as His children to bless and not curse, that we may inherit a blessing. Amen. Release a shout.
Planting the seed of religious freedom was of utmost importance to Penn. That seed, too, is breaking through in far-flung regions of the world.
My first trip to Kurdistan was in 2004 by invitation of the Department of Health, and it was because I was a behavioral science professor and I was asked to come and train the medical doctors in Kurdistan to help them help the people heal after the Saddam regime had come down. The news at the time was that this is a war zone. Everybody said, what are you doing going to a war zone? And it was very surprising coming here. It was a place of peace that even our own U.S. military were coming here to rest during the time of the war.
During the many subsequent trips to Kurdistan, Abby and her husband Jim developed a close relationship with many top government officials, including Tamar, governor of Duhok.
He invited us to his headquarters, and that opened the door to us getting involved with government leaders. He said, where are your businessmen? Where are your legislators? So we ended up bringing people for an educational exchange between our nations. So a first invitation of the Kurdish Democratic Party leaders was with Governor Tamar bringing a team, and they came to Pennsylvania, and they saw the Capitol tour that tells the history of William Penn getting the vision to have a safe haven for all those that were religiously persecuted.
Visiting the United States was very important to me. I was honored to be in their presence and the opportunity for us to speak to the government officials of Pennsylvania.
They were so amazed that Penn got this vision from God. I remember them just patting their hearts and saying, if this is a vision for how government should be, then that's what we want to follow.
Before we came to the U.S., we knew that the U.S. is made of many different nationalities and religions, and Pennsylvania was part of that. After we came, we realized how much we have in common. This made the relationship closer.
So they ended up saying, we want to have the first frame of government that Penn wrote. We want to have that, and we want to use that for writing when we would get our own nationality. We want to have that kind of government under Almighty God.
Abby and Jim are here in Kurdistan again to visit a Christian village that was protected by the Kurdish Peshmerga forces from certain destruction by ISIS terrorists. They will travel with the army's commander, General Aziz. The Syrian Orthodox monastery of Marmata is located on Mount Alfaf, just 12 miles north of Mosul in Iraq. It was founded in the 4th century and is one of the oldest monasteries in existence.
I am Major General Aziz Waisi, Commander-in-Chief of Sirbani Forces, Commander of Khazar Forces, and a member of High Operations in Kurdistan.
The group stops at a Peshmerga outpost en route to the monastery.
At age 12, my father was martyred in a fight against the Iraqi army. At that time, the responsibility of the house was on me. People trusted me because my father was martyred. We gave our life to our land, Kurdistan, for humanity and freedom of the people.
General Aziz was able to visit the Pennsylvania Capitol and also had a Pentagon Middle East briefing.
He wanted to come to the Pennsylvania Capitol. He came as a guest of Senator Greenleaf, and he did learn about Penn's method of bringing peace without weapons of war. Well, that really resonated with the way that the Peshmerga operate. They consider themselves peacemakers that they want to help to protect and to serve the needs of the people.
For centuries, the Kurdish people have faced hardship as they were attacked by larger, more powerful nations.
The countries surrounding us always want the Kurds to be their servants, or they fought the Kurds to destroy us. As they say, the mountains had the Kurds' backs, and when they couldn't control us militarily, they used chemical weapons against us.
Though places in Kurdistan lay ravaged by terrorists today, there is a rich history rooted in the soil of this land. This is the region of the ancient Babylonian Empire. The Kurdish region is part of what was once called Mesopotamia, the cradle of modern civilization. A large portion of the Hebrew scriptures give the historic background to the Jewish experience in this rugged land.
At that time of King Nebuchadnezzar, when he went and captured Jerusalem and took over the Jewish area, he captured many Jewish people and brought them to Babylon as slaves. In the Torah, there is a sentence to give news, stating that the Savior will come from the east and save you. And that leader was King Cyrus. When he came to Babylon and took over, he saved the Jews. Cyrus has a saying, "You are born free," and this is the first article of a human right.
William Penn had great admiration for King Cyrus and was greatly influenced by the benevolent ruler's model of religious tolerance and respect for all people. In fact, it was at Christ Church, Oxford, where he believes God quoted to him from Isaiah 45.
I will bring Cyrus to do good things. He shall build my city, and he shall let go my captives.
So he saved the Jews who were treated very badly. 26,000 Jews came to Mesopotamia. Before that, there were no Jews in Mesopotamia. The ones that lived in Kurdistan, they lived together peacefully throughout history. There is no division between the religions. Humanity is the main thing. The law is over everyone, but religion is between you and God. Everyone is free to their beliefs. When it comes to law, it doesn't matter who you are. It is the same for all. In most parts of Iraq, Christians were subject to many tragedies. At the same time, Kurdistan opened its doors, welcomed the Christians, and they settled here.
By definition, Peshmerga means giving your life out, dying before you. So it's natural of them to protect you, even though you're not the same religion they worship. This is beautiful. You're a Christian, I come to rescue, and I'm a Muslim.
The whole Zaravani leadership treats us, the Yazidis, the Muslims, the Christians, more like family living together peacefully.
In 2014, when ISIS came to Mosul, they gathered all the Christians and told them, either you have to convert to Islam or leave the town. They chose to move out and come to Kurdistan. ISIS fighters took everything from them, but now they live peacefully in Kurdistan.
ISIS fighters had gathered in the valley below the village but were held back by the Peshmerga forces.
General Aziz, he was standing with us for a long time ago until now in many issues, and we regard and appreciate them standing with us all the time. They support us, especially as a Christian, in the displacement period with the entering of ISIS gangs in all the fields. They open all the gates of KRG cities and towns for all the Christian, and we were honored all this time. And all of Christian, the Yazidi, the Kakai, all of them, they are living in peace together in these lands.
Kurdistan ediciden, ezidi nakhaziten mesela منطقه عربا بوچی چونکی وره آزادی لنینه وره آزادیاله وره پیجوشیانه الا ایک کاره که جریمه که بکتن هکردی همی وکی کن.
Penn's holy experiment was to be an example to all nations of how peaceful coexistence should be cultivated and maintained. The seed of world peace Penn planted with his concept of a European Parliament of Nations germinated with the United Nations over 100 years ago.
And speaking today from Geneva, from the Palais des Nations, the Palace of Nations,
where the League of Nations was conceived and operated, where the United Nations was actually launched, I think William Penn still inspires us to understand the real significance of what it takes to make peace. William Penn was a visionary, in our opinion. Very many diplomats still read him and admire his legacy because he was one of the first modern men, as they say, that conceive how is it that the practicalities of peace needed to come into place.
William Penn, already at the end of the 17th century, was addressing the question of, if not world peace, at least European peace.
Penn was born in the final days of the 30 Years' War in Europe, a war that took the lives of up to 8 million soldiers and countless civilians. It was one of Europe's longest and most destructive conflicts. In no time, Europe found itself embroiled in other wars.
Half a century, really, of warfare on the European continent. And Penn was observing this and, of course, lamenting it.
Penn had seen Christians fight each other to the death, singing the same song as they hacked at each other on either Cromwell's side or the king's. He knew that whole story, which was transpiring as he grew up.
He must not be a man, but a statue of brass or stone, whose stomach does not turn when he beholds the bloody tragedies of this war in Hungary, Germany, Flanders, Ireland, and at sea.
In 1976, I joined the Department of Peace Studies at the University in Bradford, a department which was set up by the Quakers in 1973. They felt that students should be able to study peace, not only war. I have become a kind of a peace historian, and it is in this connection that I came across, of course, William Penn. When you are a student of peace, the history of peace, then pretty quickly you discover how important the Quakers are and how important William Penn is in the history of Quakerism and peace. So in 1693, William Penn wrote a short essay called An Essay Towards the Present and Future Peace of Europe by the establishment of a European Diet or Estates, which represents a number of countries.
What the peace gave, the war devours. I need say no more upon this. When the advantages of peace and mischiefs of war are so many and sensible to every capacity under all governments.
He was a visionary because he had envisioned the concept of a multilateral parliament, in this case for Europe. And William Penn definitely, we do know, inspired President Wilson, American President Wilson, when in the 1920s the League of Nations was actually launched here in Geneva. He came here and he told us that he was following in a long legacy of thinkers and philosophers and political leaders and religious leaders to then propose that humanity for the first time will create an organization that will actually have the architecture and the mechanisms to ensure peace.
Especially if they deliberate on the uncertainty of war, that they know not how or when it will end, and that the expense cannot be less, and the hazard is as great as before.
By the legacy of writings as those of William Penn, that basically say to do peace, we need to ensure harmony, dialogue, and engagement. I think William Penn definitely planted the seeds for this to happen 4 centuries later. I'll tell you, this course of war tells us back to the understanding that man really has, unfortunately, in an intrinsic manner, a fallen state. And some people listening and watching will understand what I mean with fallen. We don't understand what it is to love your neighbor fully. To love your neighbor, you actually need to go back and understand who created you and why life is so precious so as to be preserved. War should not be acceptable amongst us, but it is.
Though the fruit of Penn's seed of a peaceable kingdom has yet to be tasted in our lifetime, humanity can still cultivate it in its own heart.
The legacy of William Penn today inspires us to go back to the understanding that human beings need to have some order that begins with our spirits.
Penn quoted in his essay the scripture, "The lion shall lie down with the lamb, and that war shall yield to peace." That was his vision for the future.
The prayers, tears, treason, blood, and devastation that war has cost Christendom, for these two last ages especially, must add to the credit of our proposal, and the blessing of the peace thereby humbly recommended.
You know, William Penn said that God might make this a seed of a nation. And he really meant the seed of world peace. This is the way to be. And in that, he was way ahead of his time.
Whereas William Penn received the charter for land that would be named Pennsylvania from King Charles II on March 4th, 1681, and whereas through great personal persecution and sacrifice, William Penn sought to establish a colony of peace, unity, and prosperity.
Whereas William Penn, being of strong moral convictions and keen intellect, set forth ideas which would not only form the foundation for the United States government, but also impact the entire world.
Whereas William Penn, from his personal experience of being arrested and imprisoned by government officials for his faith, recognized the need for protection of a person's conscience and religious liberties,
Penn envisioned a more inclusive colony, tied to his desire to create a society where people of differing faiths would not only enjoy the freedom of worship as they wish, but to participate actively in a government that guaranteed that right.
And whereas the principle of brotherly love was at the heart of Penn's holy experiment, he was determined to treat the First Nations people as friends.
Penn emphasized self-government for the people. And whereas Penn declared, peace can only be secured by justice, never by the force of arms.
Therefore, be it resolved that every government, every religious community, every political and civil society organization in the world should strive toward the goal of achieving freedom of religion and conscience for everyone, everywhere, protected in law and valued by culture, and that peace treaties between nations should revisit Penn's model with the First Nations people, that we meet on the broad pathway of good faith and goodwill. No advantage shall be taken on either side, but all shall be openness and love. We proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. Amen.
Nurtured by every human being, the seeds he planted can flourish in the peaceable kingdom Penn envisioned.
Love is above all. Let us then try what love can do to mend a broken world.